The morning sun blazed across the Arizona desert as Jake Morrison guided his horse through the rocky canyon. Dust swirled around the animal's hooves, and the heat was already becoming unbearable. Jake had been tracking cattle rustlers for 3 days, following their trail deeper into Apache territory than any white man should venture alone. His weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as he noticed fresh horse tracks in the sand. These weren't the tracks he'd been following. These were different, heavier, and there were too many of them. Something was wrong. Jake dismounted and knelt beside the tracks, running his fingers through the disturbed earth. At least 20 horses had passed this way recently, all shod and riding hard, the sound of voices carried on the wind, speaking in hushed tones. Jake led his horse behind a large boulder and climbed carefully up the rocky slope to get a better view. What he saw below made his blood run cold. A group of rough-looking men had set up a temporary camp in the canyon. They weren't ordinary cowboys or even rustlers. These men wore the kind of clothes that spoke of money and authority, but their faces held the cruel expressions of men who enjoyed causing pain. Among them, Jake spotted Sheriff Coleman, a man he'd always suspected was corrupt but never had proof against. The sheriff was talking animatedly with a well-dressed stranger who carried himself like someone important from back east. Jake strained to hear their conversation, catching only fragments that made little sense at first. Then he saw them. 7 young Apache women, barely more than girls, sat bound and gagged near a makeshift wooden structure that looked disturbingly like a gallows. The women's eyes showed terror, but also defiance. They knew what fate awaited them, yet they held their heads high with the pride of their people. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, while the oldest appeared to be in her early 20s. Jake's mind raced as he tried to understand what he was witnessing. Why would these men have captured Apache women, and why had they brought them so far from any settlement? The answer came to him gradually as he continued listening to the men below. They were planning something that went far beyond simple kidnapping. The well-dressed stranger pulled out a document and spread it on a makeshift table. Even from his hiding place, Jake could see it was a map of the surrounding territory. The man pointed to various locations while speaking in urgent whispers to the sheriff. Jake caught words like mineral rights, government contracts, and provocation. Suddenly, the pieces began falling into place. These men weren't just criminals. They were part of a larger scheme involving someone with significant political connections. The Apache women weren't random captives. They were the daughters of Chief Running Bear, one of the most respected leaders among the local tribes. Their execution would provoke a massive Apache uprising, giving the government excuse to seize tribal lands that contained valuable mineral deposits. Jake realized he had stumbled onto a conspiracy that reached far beyond the desert canyon. Someone with considerable influence was orchestrating events to start a war that would result in the forced relocation of the Apache people. The mineral rights to their ancestral lands would then be sold to mining companies, making certain individuals extremely wealthy. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. More men were arriving at the camp, including several he recognized as local ranchers who had been vocal about wanting the Apache moved off their traditional hunting grounds. These weren't random accomplices. They were carefully chosen participants in a calculated plan. Jake watched as the new arrivals dismounted and joined the discussion around the map. The sheriff pointed toward the mountains where Chief Running Bear's village was located. They were timing everything perfectly. The execution was scheduled to take place just as the tribe's warriors returned from a hunting expedition, ensuring maximum emotional impact and immediate retaliation. The youngest Apache woman managed to work her gag loose and spoke defiantly to her captors in her native language. One of the ranchers struck her across the face, but she continued speaking, her voice growing stronger. Jake didn't understand the words, but he recognized courage when he saw it. These women knew they were facing death, yet they refused to show fear. As the day progressed, Jake observed the men's preparations with growing urgency. They were constructing crude nooses and testing the gallows structure. Someone had put considerable thought into making the scene look like frontier justice rather than cold-blooded murder. They even had false wanted posters prepared, claiming the women were guilty of attacking white settlers. The sun was beginning to set when Jake made his decision. He couldn't wait for help that might never come. 7 innocent lives hung in the balance, and beyond that, the fate of an entire people rested on preventing this manufactured atrocity. He had to act, but he needed to be smart about it. Going in with guns blazing would only get everyone killed. Jake spent the evening hours studying the camp layout and guard rotations. The men were confident in their remote location and posted only minimal security. They clearly didn't expect anyone to find them in this isolated canyon. That overconfidence might be their downfall. As darkness fell, Jake made his way closer to the camp. The men had built a large fire and were passing around bottles of whiskey, celebrating their anticipated success. Their loose tongues revealed more details about the conspiracy. The Eastern stranger was a government agent working with corrupt officials in Washington. The mineral surveys had already been completed, and mining equipment was positioned nearby, ready to move in once the Apache were forced from their lands. The women remained bound near the gallows, guarded by 2 men who seemed more interested in drinking than watching their prisoners. Jake noticed that the youngest woman was still working at her bonds, using a sharp stone she had somehow managed to conceal. Her determination gave him hope that they might be able to help themselves if given the opportunity. Jake retreated to plan his next move. He had his rifle, his sidearm, and the element of surprise, but he was vastly outnumbered. Success would require careful timing and more than a little luck. As he prepared for what might be his final night, Jake thought about the larger implications of what he had discovered. This wasn't just about saving 7 women, it was about preventing a war that would destroy an entire way of life. The conspirators had chosen their victims carefully. Chief Running Bear's daughters weren't just symbols, they were living links to Apache tradition and culture. Their deaths would not only provoke military retaliation, but would strike at the heart of tribal identity. Jake understood that he wasn't just fighting criminals. He was standing against forces that saw human life as expendable in pursuit of profit and power. Dawn approached with deceptive calm across the canyon. Jake had positioned himself on the rocky ledge above the camp, his rifle ready and his heart pounding. The conspirators were preparing for the execution, their movements efficient and businesslike. They had done this kind of thing before, and their casual cruelty made Jake's blood boil. The government agent was directing the final preparations, while Sheriff Coleman practiced his speech for the mock trial. They planned to create the appearance of legal proceedings before carrying out the murders. Wanted posters were being nailed to trees, and someone was even preparing to take photographs that would serve as evidence of their twisted version of justice. Jake knew he had one advantage, the element of surprise. These men expected no interference in this remote location. They had grown careless, confident in their isolation and political protection. But Jake also knew that once he made his move, there would be no turning back. Success meant saving 7 innocent lives and exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Failure meant death for all of them. The youngest Apache woman had managed to loosen her bonds during the night. Jake could see her carefully working to free her sisters while pretending to remain helpless. Her intelligence and courage impressed him. She understood that their survival might depend on being ready to act when the opportunity came. The sound of horses approaching made everyone in the camp look up. Jake cursed under his breath as he saw more riders entering the canyon. These weren't part of the original group. They were Apache warriors, riding hard toward the camp. Someone had discovered the kidnapping and tracked the captors to their hideout. The timing couldn't have been worse. The warriors were riding straight into a trap. The conspirators had superior weapons and defensive positions. What should have been a rescue attempt was about to become a massacre that would provide the perfect justification for their larger scheme. Jake made a split-second decision. He couldn't save everyone by himself, but he might be able to create enough confusion to give the warriors a fighting chance. He took careful aim at the rope holding up a large tarp that provided shade for the main group of conspirators. His shot was perfect, bringing down the heavy canvas and temporarily blinding several men. The camp erupted into chaos as men scrambled for their weapons, unsure where the attack was coming from. Jake used the confusion to his advantage, moving quickly along the ridge and taking shots at anyone who tried to organize a defense. His years of experience as a cowboy had made him an excellent marksman, and every shot found its target. The Apache warriors reached the camp just as Jake's attack created maximum confusion among the defenders. The youngest woman had freed herself and was working frantically to untie her sisters. Jake provided covering fire as the warriors engaged the conspirators in fierce combat. But the government agent was smarter than the rest. Instead of joining the fight, he had grabbed the youngest Apache woman and was using her as a human shield while backing toward his horse. Jake could see the desperation in the man's eyes. His carefully planned scheme was falling apart, and he was willing to kill to escape. Jake left his position on the ridge and made his way down into the canyon. The fighting was intense, with men using whatever cover they could find among the rocks and scrub brush. The sheriff had taken a bullet in the shoulder, but was still directing his men's defense. Several of the ranchers were down, but others continued fighting with the desperation of men who knew they faced death or prison if captured. The government agent reached his horse and began mounting while still holding the young woman. Jake knew he had to act quickly. Once the man escaped, he would return with military forces and claim that the Apache had attacked first. The massacre would still serve the conspirators' purposes, even if most of the original participants were dead or captured. Jake stepped into the open, his pistol trained on the government agent. The man saw him coming and pressed a knife to the young woman's throat. His expensive clothes were torn and dusty, but his eyes still held the cold calculation of a professional manipulator. "Drop your weapon, cowboy," the agent snarled. "This girl dies if you take another step." Jake kept walking, his gun steady. He had noticed something the agent hadn't. The young Apache woman had palmed the sharp stone she had used to cut her bonds. She was waiting for the right moment to use it. "You're going to kill her anyway," Jake replied calmly. "Just like you planned to kill all of them. Your whole scheme depended on their deaths." The agent's grip on the knife tightened. "You don't understand what's at stake here. This land contains enough copper and silver to fund the territorial government for decades. A few Apache lives are a small price to pay for progress." "Progress?" Jake spat. "You call murder and land theft progress?" The fighting around them was beginning to die down as the Apache warriors gained the upper hand. Most of the conspirators were dead or wounded, but Jake couldn't let the mastermind escape. This man held the key to exposing the entire conspiracy and preventing future atrocities. The young woman met Jake's eyes for a split second, and he saw her prepare to move. When she struck with the sharp stone, cutting deep into the agent's arm, Jake was ready. His shot took the man's center mass, spinning him away from his captive and ending his threat permanently. The remaining Apache women were quickly freed as the last of their captors surrendered. Chief Running Bear's daughters embraced their rescuers with tears of relief and gratitude. The youngest woman, who had shown such courage throughout the ordeal, approached Jake with dignity that belied her years. She spoke in careful English, words she had learned from missionaries. "You saved us when you could have ridden away. Why did you risk your life for people you don't know?" Jake looked at her honest face and thought about her question. Because what's right doesn't change based on who's involved. Murder is murder, whether the victims are white or Apache. The government agent was still alive but badly wounded. Jake searched his belongings and found a leather portfolio containing documents that proved everything. Letters from Washington officials, mining contracts, and detailed plans for provoking Apache raids. The evidence was overwhelming and would reach beyond this isolated canyon to expose corruption at the highest levels. Sheriff Coleman was among the captured conspirators. His wound serious but not fatal. He would live to stand trial, though Jake doubted the man would ever see the inside of a prison. People with this kind of political protection usually found ways to escape justice. The Apache warriors gathered the evidence and prepared to take their rescued daughters home. Chief Running Bear would need to see these documents and decide how to respond to this betrayal of trust. The peace treaties his people had signed were clearly meaningless to those who saw Apache lands as resources to be exploited. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jake realized that his work was far from finished. Saving the 7 women had been only the beginning. The conspiracy they had uncovered reached into territorial government and federal agencies. Exposing it completely would require courage from people in positions of power, and such courage was often in short supply when money and political influence were involved. The ride back to civilization took 3 days, with Jake accompanying Chief Running Bear's daughters and the Apache warriors who had rescued them. The captured conspirators were bound and placed on horses, their wounds treated, but their freedom gone forever. Jake carried the leather portfolio containing the damning evidence, understanding that its contents could change the future of the entire territory. Chief Running Bear met them at the edge of Apache lands, his weathered face showing both relief at his daughter's safe return and fury at the betrayal they had suffered. The old chief listened carefully as Jake explained what he had discovered, examining each document with growing anger. The evidence painted a clear picture of corruption that reached from local ranchers to federal agencies in Washington. "This is not the first time white men have tried to steal our land through lies and murder," the chief said quietly. "But it may be the last time, if these papers can bring justice." Jake nodded grimly. "The evidence is solid, but making sure it reaches honest people won't be easy. The same corruption that planned this scheme will try to bury the truth." The youngest daughter, who had shown such courage during her captivity, stepped forward. Her name was Morning Star, and she had learned to speak English fluently from missionary teachers. "I will go with you to the territorial capital," she announced. "My testimony, along with these documents, will be harder to ignore than papers alone." Her father shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. These men have tried to kill you once. They will try again." Morning Star lifted her chin with the same defiance she had shown her captors. "If I stay silent, they will find another way to steal our lands. Other families will suffer what we suffered. I must speak the truth, no matter the danger." Jake admired her courage, but understood her father's concerns. The conspiracy involved powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Taking Morning Star to the territorial capital would put her life at risk. But her testimony might be the key to exposing the entire scheme. After much discussion, Chief Running Bear agreed to let his daughter accompany Jake, but only with an escort of his most trusted warriors. The group would travel separately from the captured conspirators, who would be turned over to federal marshals at the nearest army post. The journey to the territorial capital took a week of hard riding across desert and mountain terrain. Jake used the time to prepare Morning Star for what they would face in the white man's courts. The legal system was unfamiliar to her, and the men they would accuse had influence and resources that ordinary citizens could not match. "They will try to discredit your testimony," Jake explained as they rode. "They'll claim you're lying or that you don't understand what you saw. You must be ready for their attacks." Morning Star's dark eyes flashed with determination. "I understand more than they think. I watched them plan murder for money. I heard them laugh about starting a war. The truth doesn't change, because powerful men want to hide it. When they reached the territorial capital, Jake was surprised to find that news of the conspiracy had already begun to spread. One of the captured ranchers had confessed everything to a federal marshal, hoping to save his own life. The man's testimony corroborated Jake's evidence and provided additional details about the mining operations that were ready to move on to Apache lands. The territorial governor initially tried to downplay the scandal, claiming it was an isolated incident involving a few corrupt individuals. But Jake's evidence proved otherwise. The document showed that the conspiracy had official approval from federal agencies and involved contracts worth millions of dollars. Morning Star's appearance at the territorial courthouse created a sensation. Newspaper reporters gathered to hear her testimony, and her dignified bearing and clear English impressed even skeptical observers. She described her captivity and the conversations she had overheard with devastating accuracy, providing details that only someone who had been present could know. The government agent's portfolio contained letters that implicated federal officials in Washington, mining company executives, and territorial politicians. The corruption was so extensive that it threatened to bring down the entire territorial government. Several high-ranking officials resigned rather than face investigation, and others fled the territory altogether. Jake testified about his discovery of the conspiracy and his decision to intervene. His reputation as an honest cowboy who had no political agenda gave weight to his words. The evidence he had risked his life to preserve became the foundation for prosecutions that would continue for years. The captured conspirators faced various fates. Sheriff Coleman died of his wounds before he could stand trial, taking many secrets to his grave. Several ranchers were convicted of kidnapping and conspiracy, but received light sentences due to their cooperation with investigators. The mining company executives claimed they had been deceived about the legality of their operations and managed to avoid serious consequences. But the exposure of the conspiracy had effects far beyond the courtroom. The scandal forced the federal government to review its policies toward Native American tribes and led to investigations of similar schemes throughout the Western territories. Several mining contracts were canceled, and new procedures were established to prevent future corruption. Chief Running Bear used the attention generated by the scandal to negotiate better treaties for his people. The Apache were allowed to retain much of their traditional territory, and the government agreed to provide compensation for lands that had already been illegally seized. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was more than they had dared hope for. Morning Star became a symbol of courage and integrity, traveling throughout the territory to speak about her experiences and advocate for Native American rights. Her testimony had not only saved her own life and those of her sisters, but had helped prevent a war that would have destroyed countless families on both sides. Jake returned to his life as a cowboy, but the experience had changed him forever. He had seen how ordinary people could become part of evil schemes when money and power were involved, but he had also seen how individual courage could make a difference against overwhelming odds. The 7 women he had helped save continued to live free on their ancestral lands, raising families and preserving their culture for future generations. Years later, when Jake was asked about his decision to intervene in the canyon that day, he always gave the same answer. Sometimes you find yourself in a place where you can do something about injustice. When that happens, you have to choose what kind of person you want to be. The conspiracy had been defeated, but Jake knew that the forces behind it had not disappeared. Greed and racial hatred would continue to threaten innocent people throughout the territory. The victory in the canyon had been important, but it was only one battle in a larger war for justice and human dignity that would continue long after the last conspirator had been brought to trial. Morning Star's courage had shown that truth could triumph over lies, but only when people were willing to risk everything to defend it. Her testimony had saved not just her own people, but had protected the principle that all human life had value, regardless of race or culture. In the end, that principle was what Jake had really been fighting for in the desert canyon, where 7 innocent women had faced death at the hands of men who saw them only as obstacles to wealth and power.